Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranawardi, board member for ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. I would like to thank our partners for this evening, the Yale Club of Washington, D.C., and the members for being with us tonight. We are very honored to have Dr. Joshua Fisher, research scientist and director of the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity at Columbia's Climate School, talk about managing environmental conflict, which is the title of his most recently published book, which is a primer for the Earth Institute at Columbia University. In addition to his involvement with the Climate School at Columbia, Dr. Fisher is also a specially appointed professor at Hiroshima University's Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability. He works with public, private, and nonprofit partners to develop conflict-sensitive approaches to land use planning and natural resource management, and has worked in environmental management around the globe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Asia-Pacific region, of course, on public lands in the Western United States. Without further ado, Dr. Fisher, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to join everyone today. Thank you to the Columbia University Club in Washington, D.C. and the Yale Club in D.C., as well as to the president for inviting me to come and speak with you all tonight. Tonight, I'd like to speak to you about a recent book that I published on managing environmental conflict. I'll just share my screen quickly. And hopefully everyone can see this. So as the president mentioned, I am a research scientist at Columbia University's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity. That's one of the 12 research units at the Columbia Climate School, formerly the Earth Institute. And our center focuses on the intersection of peace, conflict, and sustainability. As mentioned, I'm also a professor at Hiroshima University, where I teach and build research programs around the nexus of peace, conflict, and sustainability. And that's the lens I bring to this discussion around environmental conflict, an interdisciplinary lens that's really applied in its focus, but bridges the social and the natural sciences to ask the question, how can we better manage the natural world to prevent conflict and generate social and environmental dividends? And so that's what this book is about. For a bit of background, as a research scientist, I've been pretty fortunate to work around the world in a variety of ecosystems and ecological contexts, from being a land use planner in the Western United States to being a conservation scientist in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, Asia Pacific. Also supporting agricultural interventions and agricultural and livelihood programs around the world. I've worked in a lot of different places and a lot of different sectors and ecosystems, private sector, public sector, academia. And across all of these experiences, one of the things that I've learned is environmental work is hard. It's really, really difficult. One of the things that makes it difficult is that conflict tends to be a pretty common factor in environmental management. My slides seem to be frozen, I'm sorry. As I mentioned, across all these ecosystems, across all these different sectors, conflict tends to be a pretty omnipresent social dilemma or social phenomenon. And so I've spent most of my career asking the questions, why is conflict so prevalent in these, vastly different contexts? And how can we manage conflict to more effectively generate social and environmental dividends, more effectively manage the natural resource base that's important for so many economies and so many livelihoods, and do it in a way that doesn't create more conflict. And so my book really asks these two questions. Why is it so prevalent? And what do we do about it? So tonight I'd like to discuss a few of the themes and frameworks that are included in the book to help the audience get a sense of, of these two questions. And I'd invite members of the audience to please include any questions you might have or comments or observations in the chat box, and we'll spend some time after I present some of the frameworks from the book discussing your questions. So as a starting point, why is conflict so prevalent in environmental problems or in environmental management? As I think about this, and as I've worked in various contexts, I've tried to understand this from the lens of multiple different types of people. So if we take a very concrete example of mining conflicts in the Amazon, it might help illuminate some of the drivers of conflict or some of the reasons that conflict is so prevalent. So this is an area in the Peruvian Amazon, in the state of Madre de Dios, which is the intersection of multiple social dilemmas. What you see here is a vast scar stretching across the landscape. And each of these little pools or pits is a mine, a gold mine. Teams of 2 or 3 people come to this area and dig up the soil, all in the hopes of extracting gold that's washed down from the Andes. And so as I think about the environmental problem that I see in this image, if I am a logger looking at this image, I might see this part of the forest as untouched and containing the tropical hardwoods that I need to make my livelihood. So I might look at this image and think, I can make my livelihood here. If I'm a river manager, I might look at this image and think, there's a huge problem of environmental contamination in a hydrologically active environment. So all of this contamination is going to wash downstream throughout the watershed and create problems across multiple different landscapes. If I am a person of indigenous descent who has historical ties to this area, I might look at this area, look at this image and think, my territory, my homeland is under real threat. We need to do something about it because we're feeling this pressure every day and we're seeing the appropriation of our territory every day. If I'm a gold miner, I might look at this same image and think, there's an area of forest that's not yet been exploited. I can make a livelihood here. And if I'm an environmental manager or a conservationist, thinking about this entire ecosystem, I might look at this and think, this is a mess. This is a real mess. What are we going to do to address these multiple types of problems? And so conflict in this sense is really, sort of omnipresent. It's inevitable. Each different stakeholder defines the ecosystem and the environmental problems in the ecosystem differently. And so as a logger, go about pursuing my logging activities, or as an indigenous community member advocating for my rights, or a conservationist trying to conserve the ecosystem services in this area, as I go about my daily work and my daily life, I'm going to naturally come into contact with other stakeholders in the area who are pursuing different, often incompatible interests or goals. And that's based on their worldviews, their legal rights, their goals, their assumptions about the landscape. And those assumptions, those goals aren't necessarily compatible. And that's fundamentally what conflict is, what environmental conflict is. It's social conflict around environmental issues that are based on incompatible needs, interests, positions, or goals. And so, conflict in this sense isn't negative, it's not positive, it's not necessarily anything, it's descriptive. It's not anything normative, it's descriptive of a set of social dynamics, social interactions in which different stakeholders with different understandings of an issue have incompatible needs, interests, positions. When we think about it, not normatively as good or bad, but descriptively as describing a set of interactions and a set of dynamics, that gives us some tools and some opportunities to ask the question, how can we change the social dynamics in this region? Understanding that people have real tangible needs, real tangible interests, standing rights and tenure in this environment. We can understand that descriptively and use that as a basis for collaboration. as a basis for bringing people together to work collaboratively to solve some of these environmental dilemmas. So then the question is, what frameworks, what tools can help us build that common understanding? In my book, I describe multiple different types of frameworks, some of which are adapted from ecological frameworks. So this is an ecological framework that describes transition of ecosystems across cycles of growth, conservation, collapse, reorganization. It's called the complex adaptive cycle. It was originally developed to describe predator-prey relationships and has since been adapted to describe a whole series of ecological phenomena and transitions. What it fundamentally does is describes the way a system transitions in response to change, here indicated by the delta system or this triangle. So systems are constantly experiencing change, perturbation. That can be natural, it can be artificial. The important point is a system is not stable over time. It's not static over time. It's dynamic, constantly responding to change. So to understand this complex adaptive cycle as a framework for then understanding conflict and the way conflict affects a system, let's look at a very simple example of a forest and the change phenomenon of fire. So the complex adaptive cycle, or this framework, starts with the assumption that change is constant. And following change, a system starts to reorganize. So following a wildfire, here in the lower left-hand corner, you see a forest system starting a transition process back into some version of the forest. So here we have multiple young organisms, each competing for resources, light, water, nutrients, each growing rapidly because there are a lot of nutrients that have been released by the previous fire, the previous disturbance. As these organisms compete, some mature, some build stability in the system that other more slow-moving, slow-growing organisms can capitalize on. But over time, we arrive at a mature forest. We arrive at a state of the system or a pattern in the system where stability has been established. Certain organisms tend to dominate the system. Certain organisms tend to sequester the existing nutrients in the system. And the system goes into a place of conservation. It moves out of that rapid growth and rapid competition into a stable structure. The stability, that stability is great. It enables a pattern to exist over time. What it also does, though, is create some vulnerabilities. Fuel starts to build up in this system. Trees start to age. As they age, more fuel builds up, etc. And so the same thing, that same stability that enables the system to mature also opens it up to vulnerability. In that sense, the system's primed for new disturbance. So with a heavy fuel load under the right atmospheric and climatic conditions, a lightning strike or a rogue cigarette butt can be the spark that precipitates a collapse of the system, or the release of the structure and the release of the resources in the system back into open availability, represented here as a fire coming back through the system. After that fire passes, the system goes rapidly into another reorganization process. Resources are released, seeds are dropped, new resources are available, and things like grasses can come in and quickly sequester those resources and start to build some stability in the soils that then young seedlings can capitalize on, and then shrubs, and so on and so on and so on. And the system begins another transition through this complex adaptive cycle. And so it goes. After a disturbance, the system may not come back exactly the way it was before. It may come back in a different type of forest, under a different mosaic of organisms, or it can look more or less like it did previously. The trajectory of the system through this transition process depends on the resources available, the ways in which different organisms have access to those resources, and the ability of different organisms to capitalize on those resources. So this is a very simple framework for understanding change in the system. Perhaps this fire example is overly simplistic. So let's look back at our mining example. At one point, this forest was undisturbed, but a disturbance came in the form of mining and led to the collapse of at least some parts of the system. The system won't always look like this. It won't always be this huge mining scar. At some point, the system will transition through the reorganization process. It may go back to being established forest, may go back to a predominantly forest ecosystem. Agriculturalists, on the other hand, could come in and transition this into an agricultural area, or more miners could come in and take more of the forest out of forest ground cover into mining land use. The point is that we have a disturbance here, and it started a chain reaction that will affect all the different components of the system, ultimately leading to the system cycling through this complex adaptive cycle. And so I think this is a really useful framework for understanding conflict. We can shift from just a purely ecological example to talking about the complex adaptive cycle of conflict. Conflict turns out to follow a very similar progression of rapid growth, stability, triggering or precipitating events leading to a collapse into conflict, and a social reorganization. To understand conflict, though, we have to extend this metaphor or this framework to include discussion of the institutions we use to manage the natural resource base and social relationships in the natural world. So conflict, again, is fundamentally a social phenomenon, but as social beings, as social organisms, we have a set of institutions, both formal laws, regulations, codes, etc., and informal institutions like cultural traditions, mores, informal ways of interacting with each other. These institutions structure the way we engage with each other in the natural world and the ways in which we use the natural world. So conflict, an environmental conflict, is a situation in which the institutions we use to manage our relationships in the natural world and the world itself, the natural world and the natural resources themselves, a situation in which those institutions are misaligned or maladapted to stakeholder needs. So thinking about this in terms of a complex adaptive cycle of conflict, we can think about it in terms of following some environmental change, the introduction of new mines or new mining regulations, some environmental change. We create a series of institutions to help guide our actions and interactions in the natural world. So we develop mining codes, we develop rules among the different resource users in this space on how to interact with each other. And there are many different institutions at play, each guiding some component of the system or some component of social interaction in the system. Over time, though, a few of those institutions become the dominant ways that we manage stakeholder relationships or stakeholder conflicts in the environment. So we'll tend to use in the United States the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, as one of the principal tools for environmental management. We might also use something like litigation as a primary tool for dispute resolution, right? Out of the hundreds of cultural, informal, and formal legal avenues for and institutions for managing relationships, we tend to use a couple, one or two or five, to navigate our social environmental interactions. And that's great. They're very effective. They're long-standing existing institutions for a reason. We use them because they're effective. But remember, change is constantly accumulating in the system. So change in my needs, change in the economics of a certain aspect, changes in the regulatory framework regarding this space. Those changes over time start to misalign or increase the incompatibilities between one or two or multiple stakeholders and the ways in which they interact with each other and with this environment. And so ultimately, as change continues to accumulate, that institutional architecture is no longer able to assist me pursuing my needs and assist you in pursuing your needs. And so at some point, that architecture breaks down and we end up in a conflict over that environmental question. When that conflict occurs, when that conflict becomes manifest, the institutions we formerly depended on no longer help us navigate the new social dynamic of conflict. And so instead, what we need to do is pull from different resources, different institutions to help us navigate this conflict, ultimately leading us back to the reorganization of the legal and informal institutional architecture that governs the natural resource in question or the environmental problem in question. And so through this progression, we end up with a different or a refined or a more nuanced institutional milieu or architecture. And the cycle begins again. The introduction of that new or those reformed institutions is itself a change that starts a new progression through the complex adaptive cycle. In this way, conflict is really inevitable in natural resources and in the environmental management sector more broadly. Conflict's inevitable. Any change in the system is going to alter the ways in which I'm pursuing my needs and interests, you the same, and the institutions that we're using to navigate those incompatibilities. So each attempt we make to manage a conflict is itself a resolution of a conflict, but the precipitation of a new conflict, or at least the instigation of a set of actions and interactions that ultimately can lead to conflict, which requires that we pull new institutional resources in or reform the old institutional architecture, and so on and so on and so on. And so conflict, again, not bad, not good, it just describes a set of social interactions. And this complex adaptive cycle of conflict helps us understand how institutions factor into this and what we need to do in order to adjust the institutional architecture. Now, whether or not we pass quickly through this phase of conflict or really get mired in conflict depends a lot on the dynamics at play and our ability to leverage multiple institutions. And that depends on really the way we progress through conflict. So how do we progress through conflict? Well, typically, or traditionally, I should say, conflict scholars have looked at the evolution of conflict in terms of a conflict cycle that moves from latent or possible conflict through the emergence of a conflict, escalating into some really painful, really difficult stalemate that ultimately has to be resolved. It can't stay in stalemate forever. So we go through a period of de-escalation, negotiation, dispute settlement, ultimately transformation. The traditional models tend to treat conflict in this sort of linear approach or under this linear understanding. And the traditional approaches also map out the potential responses at each different phase of conflict or each different phase in the conflict cycle. What's interesting is as we go through these different responses to conflict, we start with prevention, move through an increasingly narrow set of responses, ultimately to enforcement of peace or enforcement of conflict management, ultimately, again, leading down the de-escalation curve into peace consolidation. At both ends of the spectrum, we have millions of different options for conflict management. We can think about ways of bringing stakeholders together to try and prevent the conflict through economic interventions, through dialogue, through mediation. As we move up in intensity, we have increasingly few options, right? We're left with interdiction, physical intervention. But then as we move down, we again start to open up the range of possible interventions that we can use to try and consolidate peace or transform the conflict. And so that gets me to thinking about conflict in terms not of these linear processes, but really in terms of cycles and dynamic processes. And when we think about it in terms of the intensity, if we flip those two curves on their side, what we get is what's called the hourglass model of conflict, where in the middle of the conflict intensity or conflict escalation cycles, we're really operating on a constrained set of interventions and actions that we can do to navigate the conflict. When conflicts move into this space, they tend to become mired there in what are called destructive dynamics. In other words, dynamics in which stakeholders become increasingly polarized, increasingly reticent, and the range of actions to manage the conflict become increasingly few. Whereas either the top or the bottom of that intensity curve, where the intensity is lower, we have many more options for bringing people together in more collaborative ways. And so collaborative dynamics have a way of pulling the system, this conflict system, into a more open interactive space. And what drives that is social capital. And so the collaborative dynamics are really built around bringing people together, around building social capital. What that social capital does is it serves to build trust. It serves to build a history of interaction and collaboration. But more importantly, what it really serves to do is help each different stakeholder understand each other's needs, interests, positions. They don't necessarily agree with them, but they understand them in sort of a humanizing way. In that sense, they can empathize with them and still pursue their own needs and interests and positions. But when we lose social capital, we end up in these really destructive dynamics. And so as a conflict progresses through that complex adaptive cycle, social capital really is key to enabling stakeholders to identify other types of institutions for managing their social interactions. It also builds that trust and that history of engagement they can use to propel themselves more quickly up the reorganization part of the conflict curve, or that complex adaptive cycle, into a reorganization process. So social capital really is crucial, and it's really the linchpin for conflict management and effective environmental conflict management. In the book, I describe and adapt another framework that helps us provide a roadmap, really, or a recipe for building social capital. And that's what Nabachi and Emerson have described as collaborative governance. They describe collaborative governance as tools for social and public policy decision-making that enable multiple different stakeholders with multiple types of needs and interests to come together in a collaborative fashion to solve and address their social and environmental problems. Emerson and Nabachi described 3 engines for social capital generation or for collaborative governance. That's principled engagement, shared motivation, and capacity for joint action. Each of these motors is necessary for effective environmental governance, but none are sufficient. They have to operate in tandem, just like gears in a motor. If one of the gears stops, the entire collaborative endeavor crashes to a halt, right? And I won't go into great detail on what these motors include, but what they serve to do functionally is establish a base of collaboration. In other words, the principles on which stakeholders agree to come together. build and reinforce social capital. In other words, develop the shared motivation to work together and to continue working together. And most importantly, add value to the existing or to the participating stakeholders. So it's great for people to say, we're in conflict, we need to come together. Here's how we want to come together, and here's the motivation we have to do it. But unless the collaborative endeavor is actually generating value for each stakeholder, no one has the incentive to stay in a collaborative endeavor, to devote resources to the endeavor, and when it gets difficult, continue interacting in the face of continuing change and new challenges. So each of these is really critical, but what they serve to do, again, is build that social capital that opens up the conflict space into a more collaborative set of dynamics where there are more options available for stakeholders to use to try and manage their incompatible needs and interests, and do so in a way that's environmentally responsible and ultimately sets up a more sustainable environmental management system. And so again, this is just helping describe the ways in which we can navigate this complex adaptive cycle of conflict, where the institutions we use to manage social and environmental interactions break down, leading to conflict. Social capital is critical to pulling us back through the reorganization process in a way that's more effective. So in the book, what I've done is develop a framework called Collaborative Environmental Conflict Management that's based on these constituent frameworks, the ecological frameworks, the traditional conflict frameworks, and the synthesized social and ecological frameworks. This process of collaborative environmental management is really helping us navigate this curve by asking and answering a series of questions. First, what are the changes that are occurring in a system that could lead to conflict? What are the pressures that different stakeholders are feeling? What are the pressures that are affecting the natural resource base, et cetera? Next, what are the social and institutional vulnerabilities in the system that could lead to collapse and conflict? In other words, what's happening in the system and how is the system becoming vulnerable to conflict? From there, what are the flashpoints or triggers that could spark a conflict? What are the precipitating events that could move potentially incompatible interests into outright conflict, whether it's legal, legislative, or violent? And based on that set of analyses, which actions, initiatives, or interventions could facilitate a reorganization of the system into a more beneficial state? So in other words, the framework walks us and us being stakeholders in the system through this analytical process of collectively identifying the multiple problems we're facing, the multiple needs, interests, positions that everyone has, the goals that each of the different stakeholders has, that institutional architecture that we're leaning on to help navigate these pressures and these incompatible needs and interests, potential conflicts. But then all of that analysis toward the end of collaboratively developing initiatives and interventions to manage conflict as well as the natural resource base. But sort of embedded in all this is the assumption that we, stakeholders in the system, can come together. So the question that this framework also helps explore is, who needs to be involved in this process, in this collaborative process? How do we involve them? And at which phase of this process do we involve them? And so the framework, just quickly, has three components. Each is analytical in its own right, and each is collaborative in its own right. But the first component is that process of discovery and definition. In other words, collaborative conflict analysis, where we ask all those questions around what and who and where and why to develop a theory of how the conflict operates, a theory of a theory of the conflict. And it's important here that we develop this theory because as an environmental scientist, I'm one, prone to thinking in theories and hypotheticals, but two, using that analysis to validate my theory of conflict. If I treat it as a theory, not as a fact, then I can gather data, refine my understanding over time. We can include new stakeholders in the analysis process, bring new perspectives in, new sources of information, refine our theory over time. Together, as we start to explore this complex adaptive cycle of conflict, we develop this theory, but then move into a collaborative action component where we collaboratively plan, design, and start to implement some of these interventions, whether they're legal reforms, whether they're environmental management actions, or whether they're social processes like negotiation, mediation, arbitration. We use this phase of the process to develop a theory of collaborative action. Again, a theory on how we can work together to solve our social and environmental problems. And as we start to implement, we need to learn. We need to learn how the implementation is progressing, whether or not it is addressing the problems that we identified, whether it's creating new problems and how. We need to constantly, continuously monitor the implementation of our interventions in order to collect that data that we need to refine our theories of conflict and action. Again, treating this as a theory, in order to be able to learn better over time, better, more collaboratively over time, build new analytical processes in, build new discursive or discussion processes into the policy and action processes. Again, as a theory, we can refine over time. But in this sense, the collaborative environmental conflict framework is really action-oriented, action and analysis-oriented, trying to use a data-driven approach to enhanced social and environmental management. So just quickly, before I turn it over to questions, I want to give some context on how this framework developed and how it's been implemented in situ. So a lot of my work, as I mentioned at the outset of this, has been based on applied environmental management, either at the governmental level, the non-governmental level, or as an applied research scientist, supporting decision-making through scientific services. One of the places where I've worked extensively is in the Peruvian Amazon. And this framework was really built out of more than a decade of applied work in the Amazon and other places. But I want to discuss just a little bit about one case that was really critical to refining this, this approach to conflict management. So we all know that the Amazon is a critical ecosystem in the face of the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the dilemmas around sustainable development. It's a critical ecosystem and it's increasingly under threat from illegal activities like illegal mining, illegal logging. It's under threat from oil and gas development, new road construction, agricultural expansion, threats associated with rural poverty, poverty alleviation schemes, as well as social conflict and weak governance. A whole host of issues make this area, this ecosystem, really vulnerable to threat. And social conflict tends to be pretty prevalent across the Amazon and particularly acute in a few places in the Amazon. One of which is in Madre de Dios department of Peru, in the southwest corner of Peru on the borders of Bolivia and Brazil. This is an area that is really critical in terms of the biodiversity it harbors, and it's the crossroads of multiple economic interests and governance interests that create hotspots of vulnerability and hotspots particularly of deforestation, which you can see in the right-hand corner. Here in the sort of lower right-hand corner of Peru, Madre de Dios is one of the hotspots for deforestation, and the deforestation is driven by these multiple intersecting threats. So with partners from government, from nonprofit organizations, conservation organizations, and civil society, I've been working across several years to develop conflict-sensitive approaches to protected area management. The protected area network in this region is really critical for safeguarding ecosystem services and for ensuring and securing the natural resource base that so many people depend on. So with partners from the government and several conservation organizations, we've looked at multiple natural resource management plans and multiple protected area management plans in terms of how they've contributed to or prevented conflict in the area. And then we've made structural adjustments to those plans collectively to try and enable better, more effective management of some of these protected areas. One particular initiative I worked on was in partnership with the Amazon Conservation Association and the Americari Communal Reserve. The Americari Communal Reserve is sort of at the crossroads of many of these pressures that I've highlighted. It's a really critical area in terms of safeguarding traditional homelands for multiple groups of people, safeguarding the ecosystem services that are so critical to ecological integrity in the area. And it's also the intersection and the crossroads of multiple competing resource needs and demands. There have been longstanding conflicts in and around the reserve over the question of whether or not to develop some of the hydrocarbon resources. There have been ongoing conflicts around whether or not mining should be allowed and where, and discussions and sort of tense discussions with the Peruvian government around how to manage the reserve and where the resources to manage the reserve should come from. And so through a series of events that I detail and describe in the book, we came together as this coalition to ask the question, how can we enhance governance and management of the reserve to be more ecologically effective and more socially sustainable, particularly safeguarding and advancing the rights of the indigenous communities whose homeland this is. And so we use the different tools and frameworks that are described in the book to ask those questions around what are the pressures, what are the institutions, what are their vulnerabilities, and importantly, what can stakeholders in the area do collectively to address some of these issues. And I won't go over these in detail, but again, the changes and the pressures are those that we've been talking about. Some of the rigidity, the institutional fragility came from artifacts of the Peruvian natural resource management codes and statutes, as well as artifacts of the former management plan for this reserve, and some of the codes and legal architecture around the extractive sector. A lot of the existing institutions to manage resources in the area had become maladapted or misaligned with the real stakeholder needs in the area. And that led to a series of precipitating events like protests over mining reforms or changes in leadership within the reserve management, as well as some of the associated groups, changes at the national level in terms of how natural resources and protected areas were managed, et cetera. Each of these changes was itself a precipitating event for smaller conflicts that scaled collectively into a larger conflict ecosystem or milieu. So together with the stakeholders in the area, we set about a 3-year project for collective conflict analysis and collective institutional strengthening and reform. We used those analyses to identify several areas where we could reform the management plan for the reserve, management capacity among different stakeholders involved in reserve management, and some aspects of protected area management across the department more broadly. We used those analyses and that planning to design a multi-step, multi-tiered process of conflict analysis, planning, and implementation that was iterative over time. And over the course of 3 years, we brought together hundreds of groups of stakeholders to be part of this planning, analysis, and implementation process, all with the goal of strengthening social and environmental management in and around the Arikari Communal Reserve. What this process and project was really effective at doing is creating a collaborative ecosystem for managing the reserve, as well as building adaptive capacity into reserve management, understanding that any one of the conflicts the reserve faced was episodic, but more importantly than any specific episode of conflict, the ways in which stakeholders interacted and the institutions they used to interact were vulnerable at a time and could be strengthened over time to build a more effective management, a more resilient management regime for the reserve. And so that ultimately the project resulted in a new institutional architecture, a history of working together across different stakeholder groups, a shared narrative around conflict and the drivers of conflict, and a different way of working together collaboratively across stakeholders to manage the reserve and the resources in and around the reserve. And several of these things have been documented in peer-reviewed papers that we published together, as well as described more effectively and more thoroughly in the book. So I'll wrap up in just a minute, but when I talk about environmental conflict management, I continually am asked, how do we assess or how do we measure success in conflict management? If conflict's omnipresent and always destined to return, what does success look like? And importantly, how do we design for sustainable conflict management? In the book, I discussed 3 sort of heuristics or guides for effective conflict management. And they're all rooted in environmental justice. For me, success in these initiatives and these frameworks and approaches to conflict management, success looks like a process that's just, a process that involves the right stakeholders across the entire analytical and implementation process. A process that empowers stakeholders to have their voices taken seriously, their needs and interests effectively addressed. If an intervention comes out of a collaborative process that isn't fair, it's destined to fail. So the second aspect of effective environmental conflict management is one that's distributively just, or one in which not just the process is effective and fair and inclusive, but the ways in which decisions are made and the types of decisions that are made and the value that's added to different stakeholders is fair. We can have a great process and still end with decisions and agreements that are unjust. And so that's not effective environmental conflict management. We need both a fair process and fair outcomes. But we also need retributive justice or implementation of those agreements that's done in a way that's transparent, fair, and mutually agreed on. If we don't have these 3 sort of motors of environmental justice, then the agreements we reach and the processes that we pursue really are setting ourselves up for future episodes of destructive conflict or more destructive conflict dynamics. So for me, these 3 aspects are critical. And really when those 3 motors of procedural, distributive, and retributive justice are operating in tandem, what we have is a motor or a mechanism for transformative justice, or yeah, system transformation, really. So just in closing, you know, at the start of this discussion, I said one of the things across all the places I've worked, one of the things I consistently see is conflict. And that's true. But one of the other things I see, or one of the complementary things that I also see across all these places I've worked, is people coming together to collectively and collaboratively solve problems. Just as conflict is sort of omnipresent, everywhere I work, I see real deep intention to work together, to set aside differences, to set aside histories of conflict, division, and in some cases violence, to try and do environmental management better. And by better, I mean in a way that enables better social outcomes and better environmental outcomes. And so as I reflect back on you know, the last 10 years of research and applied science that have gone into this work, I really am hopeful in terms of the trajectories that at least public policy and applied environmental management are headed, in terms of taking conflict seriously and developing approaches to manage environmental conflicts to address and achieve both social and environmental concerns. And so with that, I want to thank everyone for coming to this discussion, and I'd love to hear any of your reactions or thoughts or questions from what you've been hearing and what I've been discussing.
All right, hello, thank you so much. We do already have a few questions coming in. My name is Miyako Yerrick. I'm the admin for the ColumbiaDC Club. So just a reminder, everybody, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A function. It's a little bit easier for us to track. And then we have just over half an hour to try and get through the questions. So kind of, we had a couple questions come in at the very beginning on your methodology around the complex adaptive cycle. So I don't know if you could talk a little bit about how you came up with that, the Greek letters, the figure 8 versus a cycle or just a circle. So maybe a little bit about that process.
Yeah, absolutely. So that framework, the complex adaptive cycle, is a framework that's been developed over the last 40 years in ecology. Each of the symbols represents a different phase in the system. So the alpha phase, the alpha symbol, signifying the start of a new cycle, right? And then the conservation phase with the K standing for conservation, meaning the point at which the resources are sequestered. The omega symbol, meaning the point at which that stability that's established and conserved collapses, so the end of that order, and simultaneously the start of a reorganization process. So rather than it being a simple circle, it really is more akin to two loops, or to what the original authors called double loops. The front loop being that process of sequestering resources, competing for resources and sequestering them, and the back loop being the process of reorganization, erosion of the original structure and stability, and the emergence of a new structure and stability. And so it's not as they've articulated it, particularly in this topography or topology of the loops, for reasons that are more analytical. You can set a three-dimensional space up with different axes for the degree to which resources are sequestered, the degree to which resources are integrated with each other, what they call the closeness and the connectedness of the system. So the topology is important when you think about it from the ecological perspective, but at a more metaphorical sense, and using it in this context, it's just useful to think about it in terms of two connected processes. That front process, that's resource sequestration and stability, and that back loop, that resource reorganization process.
Okay, great. We have a couple questions about the US, so I thought we would start there, and then a couple on Brazil. So I do want to get to Brazil, but maybe starting at home. we have a question based on your framework. How do you suggest the 7 Southwest states of the US how to manage their water shortage, considering the current treaty to share water from the Colorado River is coming up for renewal in a few years?
Yeah, that's a really important question, one that I'm probably not as well suited to answer and address as the person who asked it, I'm sure. But for me, this framework is useful in the sense that it serves as a diagnostic tool for understanding where the institutional architecture is malfunctioning or misaligned. And so the original treaty that divides water among the 7 riparian states, that's an institution that we've depended on for a long time. And as water budgets have changed, as water budgets are increasingly changing with the changing climate, and as demographic shifts have taken place and industrial and technological shifts have taken place, that institution, that treaty, is no longer effective for managing water in the system. Using this framework, we can diagnose exactly where and in which ways that institution is misaligned with stakeholder needs or the ecological needs, and use that as a starting point for asking the question, one, what are the real hydrological constraints and needs? What are the technological constraints and needs? And importantly, how can we reform this existing institution, this treaty or this framework? Or do we need to throw that out and design an entirely new institutional architecture to manage the Colorado River in this new context? If we look historically, we've treated this, this water division system as sort of static law and static, unmalleable, unchanging law, which is not the way a dynamic system functions. So if we use this type of approach for diagnosing where the institution is broken down, in which ways it's not helping stakeholders, both ecological and human stakeholders, meet their needs, then it gives us a roadmap for institutional reform.
Okay, you mentioned perceived conflict. And so there's a question around specifically how the US is benefiting from Chinese manufacturing and indirectly from their lax environmental rules. So on the surface, though, we have this conflict with China on how to protect the environment, climate change. So they ask, how would one fix a paradox like that?
Again, the person asking is probably much more expert than I in that specific nuanced context. What I will say that hopefully is of any use is that, conflict has this objective and this subjective reality. There are ways in which needs and interests are actually misaligned or incompatible. And there are ways in which one or the other party perceives this misalignment, this incompatibility. And both are important for understanding conflicts when they erupt and whether or not they go in destructive or collaborative and constructive ways. And, in the context of US-China relations, particularly around manufacturing, both are probably at play on both sides of the stakeholder equation. There are ways in which the needs and interests and goals of both parties are terribly misaligned and creating real divisions. But there are also ways in which the needs and interests are absolutely aligned, and both groups are benefiting from this arrangement and from the perceptions around this arrangement. So, it's, again, really complicated, but unpacking the range of views and assumptions that are underlying each party's actions toward each other and interactions in the global space is really critical. That's the starting point. What are the needs that the US is pursuing? What are the interests the US is pursuing? The same on the Chinese side. The interesting thing, though, is it's difficult to treat, and it's not useful, I think, or it frustrates the process to treat these groups as sort of unitary stakeholders. If we look inside the US, there are multiple different stakeholders that are all sort of nested under this architecture of the United States, right? From the general public to the manufacturing sector to different actors and linkages along value chains. Each of those stakeholders has their own set of needs, interests they're pursuing vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis the US-China dynamic. And we really need to have a nuanced understanding of that entire stakeholder landscape, the sort of fractal complexity involved in both stakeholder sets or subsets, in order to understand the actual stakeholder milieu or context, identify which needs are incompatible, which institutions that govern different aspects of Chinese manufacturing and US manufacturing and that relationship, which institutions, whether they're tax or embargoes or trade agreements, which institutions are ineffectively managing that relationship or more effectively assisting some stakeholders pursue their needs vis-a-vis others. Assessing both the stakeholder landscape and then that entire institutional architecture is, I think, the starting point for institutional reform that can serve as at least the beginning of discussions across the parties. That was probably not an effective answer, or
no, that was great. And I'm sure if there are follow-up questions, they will type them in. Okay, so question from Beth, who asks if there is a collaborative dialogue happening in Brazil with the Amazon. Are there groups talking to each other, and then also in the US concerning returning land to Native Americans?
Two huge questions. I'll try to answer each. Again, not being an expert in Brazil, and I haven't worked in Brazil for quite a bit, but I've been keeping tabs on some of the things that are happening in Brazil. It seems, when I think about conflict and conflict management, one of the first questions for applying this framework is, are the stakeholders able and willing to come to a table in good faith? That has to be sort of the first diagnostic question. Who are the stakeholders? What are their needs, interests? And are they willing and able to come in good faith into a collaborative process? The answer isn't always yes. And in the case of Brazil and the current Brazilian government, there's a big question mark around both the willingness and the ability to go into discussions around Amazon forests and environmental management in the Amazon in good faith with some of the other stakeholders. So at this point, I'm not sure whether really constructive dialogue is happening. I know it is among some pockets of Brazilian society. And so the second question is, if the main parties are either unable or unwilling to come in good faith to each other, what's needed to advance that? Is it smaller dialogues and smaller collaborative initiatives among subsectors of the stakeholders in the area? Is it preliminary talks? Is it international pressure? What are the prerequisites for enabling the stakeholders to come in good faith and with the ability to actually implement agreements? It seems to me that that's the question for the context of Brazil right now. What's needed to get the stakeholders involved to a place where they're able and willing to come together to collaboratively address issues like deforestation in the Amazon? There are really excellent organizations working both inside the government and in civil society in Brazil to advance that. At this point, I don't know of any sort of national level collaborative dialogues in Brazil. But again, for me, the question is, what are the small little experiments or small initiatives that could scale over time into meaningful change? And that, I think, is where some of my hope comes in, seeing so many really interesting and really effective organizations working together and starting to build that momentum that can carry the system forward. I see real potential there. There are also countervailing forces that are really putting inertia in that, and so it's left to be seen what happens and where the Brazilian system will go. In the context of the US and land back movements, it's been interesting to watch some of these initiatives. There's a lot happening, a lot of really good work happening, with some legal wins for many, or for at least in a couple of cases, some of the Native American tribes. On the private sector side, there are some interesting initiatives where legacy farmlands are being passed back into Native American hands. So there's a lot happening. One of the interesting things for me has been watching the issue of Bears Ears, Bears Ears National Monument. This for me is sort of a classic example of that complex adaptive cycle. If we think about the decades of discussion and discourse of whether or not to establish a monument and what it would look like and how big, waves of small conflicts that escalated into larger conflicts with collaborative engagement across different stakeholder groups to move the system into a more constructive place, ultimately scaling into the designation of the monument, which was a change that initiated a new phase of stability and then conflict, which was evidenced when the Trump administration reduced the size of the monument, which started a new phase of the complex adaptive conflict cycle, different stakeholders getting together to start pushing the system again, resulting again in the expansion of the Bears Ears National Monument under the Biden administration. One of the interesting things, though, in that context is the decisions that have been made in the current administration around who leads Department of Interior, how collaborative management could or should be implemented in the Bears Ears context. The management plan that was originally designed and is now being refined and implemented for Bears Ears calls for collaborative management. It's one of the first examples of collaborative management being called for explicitly in a management plan that I know of. And it's really hopeful to me. The question is, given the history of land appropriation, and the history of conflict, and the history of divisiveness in this context, are the different stakeholders willing and able to come in good faith into collaborative management? And the answer might be no at this current moment. For good historical reasons, for some groups it might be no, it's not in our capacity to come into this arrangement. The question then is, what would it take to build trust, to build social capital, to enable groups to come together to effectively manage Bears Ears National Monument? And it's another, instance where I'm hopeful. I see a lot of potential for things like the Bears Ears National Monument to go into a constructive place. But as we're seeing just earlier this week, there's a lot of inertia and a lot of energy pushing back against that that collaborative management of the regime, with the state of Utah filing suit in federal court against the establishment of the Bears Ears National Monument. So countervailing forces, the key in moving it more constructively, again, though, is social capital. And there's not a lot of social capital existing in the area right now in terms of collaboration. But the question is, what would it take to build that social capital? Certainly, the Biden administration's putting certain persons in charge of certain agencies, I think, is a good step. Some of the land back initiatives that are happening in the public and private spaces are also really important tools for building trust and starting a history of collaboration that hopefully will be the history moving forward. But it remains to be seen sort of how the different stakeholders engage with each other and whether or not, or the degree to which they can work together to reform the institutional architecture in a way that ultimately can be more collaborative.
Okay, so we have a question from Jackie who asks, how does social media disadvantage or advantage your collaborative approach? There's so much misinformation and posturing as movie stars and politicians seek attention, and they may not, or usually probably don't have a huge knowledge base on the issue. So how does the social media affect it?
Yeah, really important question. You know, we're in a period at which social currents are changing rapidly, and the justification for social narratives is changing rapidly and evolving rapidly. And so when I think about social media, I think about it in sort of two ways. One is social media as an informal institution. You know, it is one of the artifacts or institutions we use to deliberate and propagate information or disseminate narratives and information. So in that sense, social media has become a really powerful institution in affecting stakeholder perceptions around a given issue. It's also, as we've been seeing, increasingly, it's maladaptive to stakeholder needs or being manipulated by some stakeholders to pursue their needs. And so it's an institution that's, you know, potentially maladapted to effective collaboration. But it's also it's just descriptive of a set of communication channels that could be reformed or could be utilized differently to advance more collaborative narratives or narratives that are combating disinformation. So it's this institution that's really complex, one that we're having legislative and regulatory and social discussions around how do we use this institution? What's it good for? What's it not good for? And how's it affecting our ability to pursue our needs and interests? So I think about it from an analytical perspective, diagnostically. Where is it effective at building collaboration? Where is it being used to sort of disincentivize or hamper collaboration? When I think about it in that way, it becomes something we can diagnose, something we can analyze, and develop theories around how to reform it or revise our use of it as an institution for managing conflict. You know, and the other aspect of it is thinking back to maybe the Brazil example or the questions when stakeholders aren't able or willing to come together in good faith. It becomes an alternative institution. If we're using just the court system or just legislative processes as the primary ways we manage social interaction, and that's created this polarized, sort of toxic or deadlocked environment, then social media can come in as an alternative institution we can pull in to try and reshape narratives, to try and reshape the ways we think about each other, humanize other stakeholders, illuminate some of the environmental issues that need to be solved collaboratively, or give voice to stakeholders who are disenfranchised or disempowered. You know, use this institution, this alternative institution, as a way of sort of equalizing the playing field and shifting the dominant narratives. So it becomes both an diagnostic, it can be used sort of diagnostically as well as in terms of a theory of collaborative action that we again can refine over time as we learn more about it.
Great. So there's a question here on what, in your professional opinion, are the top 3 causes of environmental conflict, you know, plus or minus, but they say poverty, corporate interest, race and cultural differences. If you can go into them just a little bit.
Whew, another huge question. Yeah, you know, those are all huge topics and really important topics. And I don't want to trivialize any of them in any way. They're also descriptive of a set of social interactions. So we can think of them normatively as examples of injustice that cause grievance, that can lead to conflict. We can also think of them descriptively as describing, in this moment, a set of relational dynamics. For me, we need to think about them in both terms, but it's really useful to think of them descriptively as these are the current dynamics, these are the current contexts and conditions, and take one step back and ask what's underlying those patterns that we're seeing. Who are the stakeholders involved? What are their needs, interests, power differentials, and what is it about this set of dynamics or this set of conditions that's inhibiting some stakeholders from pursuing their own needs and interests and goals, or enabling other stakeholders to pursue and advance their own needs, interests, and goals at the expense of others. So again, you know, diagnostically, who's involved and what are the current contexts? How is it creating division or creating incompatibilities? And what are the institutions that are enabling that? When we get to that point, it leads directly to institutional reform. We see in something like economic injustice, both as a normative issue that's really important to address, and mechanistically as a tool that enables some stakeholders to pursue their needs over others. And these are the institutions that are enabling that. And the product is conflict and further injustice and systemic marginalization. So with that, we have both the roadmap of which institutions need to be reformed and why. The question then is, how can we come together to build that energy to cycle the system through that complex adaptive cycle?
Okay, we have a question from Giannis, who asks if you can tell us if you lean more towards Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons or Ahlstrom's Common Pool Resource Management Techniques, and is there a geographic definition of common or community participation? How far from an important area would or should communities allowed to dictate how they should be managed?
Not an easy question again, really profound, and one that I really, really appreciate. In the book, I include examples of both the tragedy as well as common pool resources. And in the book, in one of the more theoretical chapters, I discuss the ways in which they're sort of components of a larger phenomenon, and both have aspects that manifest in our lived reality. I tend to lean more toward the tragedy of the commons in a very short time horizon. There are ways in which ecological timelines and legislative timelines and stakeholder timelines just don't operate at the same rate. And that functionally serves to lead to some of the tragedy, like the mining example I showed in Peru, in the short term. In the longer term, though, what I've seen consistently over time is more like Ahlstrom's common pool resources. You know, I just continue to see people coming together to collectively manage the resource base, you know, not perfectly, and in ways that set up other or associated conflicts and environmental problems. But I do see this common pool approach more over longer time periods. I see that being the more dominant of the management techniques. The question around stakeholders is really profound. If we lived in a less globalized world and a less globally impacted world, the issue of stakeholders is more clear cut. We don't live in that world. And so, you know, I think about deforestation in the Amazon. The question is, who's a stakeholder? Well, in one sense, it's the groups directly in and around that specific geography. The Amazon rainforest or, you know, tropical forests. At a larger sense, though, if we scale out ecologically, we're all stakeholders. We're all depending on the carbon sequestration, ecosystem services. We're all depending on the provisioning ecosystem services, oxygen production, climate regulation, genetic preservation. So we're all stakeholders in that. Whose stake is more direct, more tangible, more immediate? There are answers to that question, but in larger timescales and the timescales that our social and environmental dilemmas are operating on, you know, we're fundamentally all stakeholders, which means we're all involved in the causes and potential solutions for some of these dilemmas. But, you know, it gets to the question of colonialism and how different stakeholders ought to be invited into the discussion and where and under what conditions different stakeholders should be involved in problem solving. And that is, you know, way beyond the scope of this discussion. But maybe I'll pause there for a minute.
Great. Giannis also mentioned colonialism, so you'll have to come back for a whole nother talk another time. But speaking of stakeholders, we had a question from Brian. You mentioned that a few institutions often emerge to dominate during the conflict cycle. So he says, how do you ensure that a variety of the stakeholders will have decent power? And he says it's probably hard to get the three motors of justice to function when some power holders would surely aim to squelch others' voices.
Absolutely. And Emerson and Nabachi in their book discuss how to enable and implement a collaborative governance regime, sort of the limits to the functionality and the, the timeline for that collaborative governance regime to operate. They do a much better and more eloquent job of describing that. For me, though, the secret is really in asking that first question: are stakeholders willing and able to come in good faith into collaboration? If not, then what's needed to enable that? And often that is correcting power imbalances, revising or refining or questioning and re-examining narratives and assumptions about each other. So there's a lot of pre-work that has to get done to enable collaboration to really be possible. And for those three motors of collaboration, the principled engagement, the shared motivation, and the capacity for joint action to turn simultaneously. But once you get those motors turning, if you can pay attention to the underlying mechanisms that drive each, and do it in a way that's really adaptive, then you have a way of not imposing a static governance system on a dynamic context. You have a dynamic governance process that either can slow the rate of change cycling through this complex adaptive cycle, or speed it up and pass through much more quickly and much less painfully. So if we build an adaptive system, then we're able to understand, oh, right now we're misaligned with this stakeholder group's needs or this new environmental dynamic. Let's change the way we're managing the system. Let's change the way we're interacting and making decisions, and cycle really quickly and painlessly through that reorganization process to arrive at a slightly altered, slightly different, and hopefully much more effective governance system. Same overarching framework, possibly the same actors involved, but a much more adaptive system, and one that's continually refined and retuned to shifting needs. you know, in response to both social and ecological changes. But the key really is, you know, in that pre-work, what needs to be done to enable people to be willing and able to come together in good faith.
Great. Well, I want to thank you so much for spending your evening with us, and to all of our attendees for their really difficult questions, I think, today. We did record the event, and so we will be sharing the recording tomorrow. There's also a link to where you can purchase the book with a discount code, so make sure you check that in the email. And in the last couple of minutes, wanted to throw it back to you and see if there's, you know, if we want to continue reading beyond your book, who are some people we should follow on social media or other books, articles, and any closing thoughts that you have for us.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate the very thoughtful and profound questions that were raised by the audience. And I appreciate everyone coming to tonight's discussion to talk about this. It's an area that I'm really passionate about and really dedicated to advancing. It's an area that's increasingly urgent, I think, for all of us to come together to try and advance our knowledge around good practices and really build energy and a community of practice for. In that sense, you know, there are some foundational authors and works that I think are worth everyone's time picking up. The work that Lawrence Susskind has done at MIT and in partnership with stakeholders around the world is really foundational to this work. Ostrom's work is really foundation. Eleanor Ostrom, her writing is foundational. Some of the work that Emerson and Nabachi have put out is also really foundational and really, really useful, I think, from a policy perspective. But also equally, a lot of the work that's coming out of conservation organizations and conflict management organizations and grassroots organizations is equally nuanced and rich and important. So I would, you know, caution us all to not get stuck in the trap of academia and published science, but also to take really earnestly and really seriously different types of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, community-based knowledge, and the actions and strategies that are being implemented on the ground. Just as important as the higher level policy levers. Also, you know, there are a lot of groups that are coming out recently, professional associations and civil society organizations that are trying to build that community of practice. Based in DC, the Environmental Peace Building Association is one that I think everyone should give real thought to and consider joining. Professional associations like the Society for Conservation Biology's Social Science Working Group are just really excellent communities to be part of. Out of Hiroshima University, the Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability, another really important community of practice that's developing. So seek out some of these professional organizations. There are similar organizations across Sub-Saharan Africa, across Latin America. Really, you know, you don't have to be bound by some of the traditional Western organizations. There are communities popping up everywhere and all asking these same questions. How do we create a more just, equitable, and ethical environmental management system given the pressures that we're facing? So just as a last word, you know, again, there are real challenges ahead. Environmental work itself is really difficult. Environmental conflict management is really difficult. But I'm hopeful when I look at the organizations I partner with or that I learn from. I'm just really, really hopeful, and I'm glad to see so many people on this event tonight. And I hope that my small contribution in the form of this book can at least point you in directions for further reading or ways to follow up on this. So thank you again to the Columbia Club in DC and the Yale Club in DC for having me. It's been a pleasure and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and if there's any of those resources that you mentioned that we can forward to everybody on the call, if you can email them to us, we can send them out to everyone. But thank you so much and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.